Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues and guests. It's December 25th, 2020, 3 p.m. Moscow time, and we're beginning the panel session for the defense of the thesis by Trofimov. The thesis is submitted for the academic degree of the candidate of legal sciences. The specialization is 120004, financial law, tax law, budget law. The topic of the thesis is legal regulation on budget systems of Russia and China. Under the order issued by St. Petersburg State University as of October 23, 2020, number 9450/1, I, Natalia Shevelova, Doctor of Legal Sciences, Head of the Administrative and Financial Law Department of St. Petersburg State University, was appointed the chair of this dissertation board. The order also approved the candidacies of the members of our board, and let me introduce them. Everyone is working in remote mode today. Oksana Nagina, Doctor of Legal Sciences, Professor of the Administrative and Financial Law Department of St. Petersburg State University. Oksana, DCS and here as well? Yes, I do. It's okay. Thank you. Natalia Pavetkina, Doctor of Legal Sciences, Head of the Financial, Tax and Budgetary Legislation Department of the Institute of Legislation and Comparative Law under the Government of the Russian Federation. Natalia, DCS and hearers. Yes, good afternoon, dear colleagues. I see you well and hear you well as well. Thank you. Roman Shipenko, Doctor of Legal Sciences, Professor of the Administrative and Financial Law Department of the MGIMO University. Roman, do you see us and hear us? Yes, the connection is quite good. Thank you. And Abdukhalil Gafurzadan, Doctor of Legal Sciences, Academy of Public Administration under the President of the Republic of Tajikistan. Abdukhalil, do you hear us? Yes? Yes, I hear you and everything is okay. Thank you. So all the members of the board are here, and our candidate for the degree, Albert Trofimov. We also have the connection with Albert. Albert, do you hear us and see us? Yes? Yes, good afternoon. Okay, thank you. We also have a connection with the thesis supervisor, Margarita Kostova, candidate of legal sciences, associate professor of the Administrative and Financial Law Department of St. Petersburg State University. Margarita, do you hear us and see us? So we don't hear Margarita right now, but we had a connection with her. I believe she'll join in. Dear colleagues, as we are working in the remote mode in order to improve the quality of our connection, kindly turn off your microphones, but do not forget to turn them on when I give you the floor. So, yet another technical point. As we may have certain technical failures, I kindly ask you to inform me at once if you have lost the connection or sound. I will announce a technical break, and as soon as the failures are eliminated, we'll move forward. If there will be a technical failure from my side, I kindly ask Oksana Nagina to announce a technical break so that I could get back, and if I won't manage to, then, Oksana, I ask you to continue to moderate our session. Oksana, do you agree? Yes, certainly. Okay, I hope that all colleagues support this proposal. That's just our option. I hope we won't have to use it. I would also like to inform you that the panel session of the dissertation board is being recorded and broadcast on the St. Petersburg State University website, and it is also interpreted into English and into Russian if the need arises. Currently, we have an email address posted on the page with a live broadcast of the board session, and all the listeners can submit their questions or opinions to Albert Trofimov online. The questions should be on the thesis or on the scientific discussion. And these questions will be forwarded to me by our technical service, and I will read them out during the discussion. Questions must be related to the presentation, the content of the thesis, and if the questions have nothing to do with the scientific discussion, they will not be voiced. Then, under the order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, approved by local normative acts, the session of the dissertation board is valid, providing 2/3 of the appointed board members are present. The total number is not to be fewer than 4 people, and the dissertation board consists of 5 people, and everyone is with us today remotely. Therefore, we have a quorum, and we can continue. And I will say a few words about the agenda so that we would be aware, as well as the guests that join us. So, our session should not last more than 2 hours, and the agenda is as follows. First comes the chairman's presentation about the documents submitted by the candidate for the degree in their conformity with the requirements. Chairman's replies to questions, if any, 5 minutes for that. Then candidate's presentation, providing an overview and findings of the research, 15 minutes. Questions to the candidate regarding the presentation, no more than 2 minutes per question, and the candidate's replies to the questions, no more than 5 minutes for questions. Then the reports on the thesis. The board members will be taking the floor in turns to provide their reviews and questions, and then the answers, the comments of the candidate about the report on the thesis, then the 10 minutes for each member of the board. Then I will deliver my report, also 10 minutes for that. After that, we'll give time to our candidate for his answers, 20 minutes for that. Then we are going to have an open discussion. Anyone present at the defense may state their position or ask questions on the thesis. And we will also voice some external reviews that were submitted. And if you want to speak out during the open discussion, and if you are not the member of the board, you need to register, to fill in the registration form and introduce yourself before you have the floor, so that we would know who is participating in the discussion. Then, the chairman will ask the questions submitted during the broadcast by our website. Then answers to these questions, a speech by candidate's thesis supervisor, 3 minutes for that. Then a 5-minute discussion before the open balloting on conferring or non-conferring the academic degree. So we'll decide whether, upon the fact whether we need such a closed discussion or not. After that, we'll have open balloting, vote counting, and recording the results in the protocol. After that, we take a decision on whether to confer the academic degree or not. And finally, the closing speech of the candidate, no more than 2 minutes for that. So, considering this agenda, we'll proceed, and I hope that will work quite efficiently. At the most so because all the documents were already published on the website and everyone willing could get acquainted with them. So, distinguished colleagues, any questions or comments on the agenda? No questions? Okay. Therefore, we proceed. And yet another technical point. I kindly ask you to turn off, to switch off your mobile phones, switch off the sound. But please don't put them far away, in case we may need them. So, Let me start. And I start with the presentation about our candidate for the degree. The thesis by Albert Trofimov for the academic degree of the candidate of legal sciences. The specialization is 120004, financial law, tax law, budget law. Is titled Legal Regulation on Budget Systems of Russia and China. The thesis was approved for the defense by the order of the academic secretary of St. Petersburg State University, issued October 21st, 2020, number 9373/1. Mr. Trofimov has prepared his dissertation at St. Petersburg State University, and Margarita Kostova, candidate of Legal Sciences, Associate Professor of the Administrative and Financial Law Department of St. Petersburg State University, is the thesis supervisor. The list of 7 published works describe the research findings. They include 5 papers published in peer-reviewed journals recommended by the Ministry of Education and Science, and 1 paper in publications indexed in Web of Science and Scopus. The candidate has submitted the full set of documents to the academic secretary. The above-mentioned documents comply with Item 12 of Section 3 of the Order on the Procedure of Granting Academic Degrees at St. Petersburg State University. All the documents, as far as I am informed, comply with the requirements, and they are found in the certification file of the candidate for the degree, and the curator of the defense, member of the Department of Dissertation Board Support, present on the session, has all the copies, and at any point we can find these documents and consider them. So, if anyone has questions on the documents, please tell me. So, no questions? Thank you. So, now I give the floor to Albert. Albert, please, you have the floor, 15 minutes for that. Thank you very much. Distinguished chairwoman, distinguished members of the board. The work that I'm going to tell you about is dedicated to legal regulation of budget systems of Russia and China. As for the relevance of this research, it is demonstrated by the growing political and economic ties between Russia and China that define the need to carry out studies of legal regulation in both countries. At the same time, the relevance can be found due to this continuing search by the lawmakers of the Russian Federation and China of the optimal models of national budget systems in the context of specification of parameters of the presence of budget and extra budgetary funds with a goal to use public money. Before the first of all, we had this goal to define the regularities in the development of the legal regulation of budget systems in the 2 countries. And as for scientific novelty, the dissertation is the first study of the legal basis of the budgetary systems of Russia and mainland China. And the result of this study is the identification of general trends and the peculiarities of the development of Russian and Chinese legal regulation of the budget systems, their structure, and characteristics, and here are some of the conclusions that I've made. Budget systems of both Russian Federation and the PRC can be characterized as hierarchical ones, complex systems that are made up from different public funds, and such systems do not include money funds dealing with private finances, and legal regulation of interbudgetary relations and distribution of budget authorities between the tiers of power, and also the implementation in PRC of the concept of one state, 2 systems, demonstrate the difference of the 2 studied budget systems, whereas Russian budget system demonstrate the characteristics of unitarism. Chinese system demonstrates some decentralization options, and an important argument here is the correlation of principles of the unity of budget system and independence of the budgets. And at that we note that the state structure does not provide for the parameters of budget system centralization. and working with the issue of evolution of the Chinese budgetary legislation provided us with a periodicity and also allowed us to detect the major trends in the development of budget legislations of Russia and PRC, including open budget systems establishment, the development of inter-budget relations, the reflection of both incomes and spending in the budget, balance of budgets, and so on. The need to address the issue on the notion of the budgetary system in China was defined, first of all, by lack of studies in the Russian literature. Lack of legal definition in the Chinese budget legislation does not prevent us to interpret the constitution of the PRC of 1982 and the budget law of 1994. We can use them to define this contemporary budget system of PRC as the one based on economic relations and state structure. And that's a combination of budget and extra budgetary funds, and the latter includes the budgets of state funds, the budgets of social insurance funds, and others. And such extra budgetary funds are organizationally and legally separated from the main budget of the PRC, but they are still closely connected. Recognizing the uniformity of these structures of the budget systems of Russia and PRC, and they include the combination of budget and extra budgetary funds, we can say that the system of extra budgetary funds in China are more divided than in Russia. The development of Russian extra budgetary funds are limited by the goals of implementation of certain constitutional rights, and this is supported by a comprehensive list of Russian extra budgetary funds. Yet the spending of extra budgetary funds in China demonstrate a broad array of public goals. And first of all, that is the development of particular public affairs, for example, the construction of railroads, the development of civil aviation, tourism, and so on. In this case, we're talking about state funds. Second, the provision of social insurance implemented via functioning of different social insurance funds. Third, the increase of the cost of public property achieved by the functioning of budgets on operation with state capital. Extra budgetary funds of different types in China have such characteristics as the presence of specific goal of their establishment, the definition of independent income sources, non-tax sources, and that is a prerequisite for the unification of formation and functioning rules of such funds, but it does not include the opportunity to legally regulate it differentially, depending on the goal. Above all, holding studies would be incomplete without addressing the issues of the formation of the budget systems principles. There are no principles enshrined in Chinese legislation, but still we analyzed the case and found these principles. Normative content of a single principle can have certain bylaws, and this is substantiated by the peculiarities of the budget and legal regulation in the PRC. Contemporary principles of the budget system of China reflect the trends of the formation and development of the fiscal policy of the Chinese state. An important function of the principles of the budget system of the PRC, considering the undetailed Chinese regulation, is the opportunity to identify the message of this legal regulation and the opportunity to fill these legal gaps. Talking about the principles of the budget system of China, we say that they correspond with the principles of Russia in content and in the regulatory essence. And here we talk about the transparency of the budget system, openness, special purpose of the funds, and full recognition of all costs and incomes in the budget, balance, efficiency, and so on. And along with that, the peculiarities of the Chinese legal system and budget legal regulation in China stipulate lack of such such characteristic principles as the principle of the budget immunity, unity of the money, and the equality of the budget rights of public and private entities. Though these principles can be quite different, for example, in the Chinese budget state, we lack a norm on the prohibition of acquisition of budget funds from just one department. the health department. Due to that, they can't exclude the case when an institution can get financing simultaneously from several departments, and this practice is quite widespread in education. When creating a new educational institution, these institutions have dual subordination to authorized authorities, and thus they do not see this risk of misuse of public funds. And vice versa, they believe that the use of this scheme of financial support will improve the efficiency of state management and the management of financial resources. In Russia and in China, we see the practice of coordination of some or other budget expenditures with incomes from specific non-tax incomes. In Russia, this approach is restrained by the principle of whole cover of the costs of the budget, though we can find certain situations when formal requirements of these principles are in fact overcome by the definition of the expenditures based on the forecasted revenues from certain income sources. And here are such examples as road funds, universal service fund, National Wellbeing Fund, and others. Whereas in China, there is direct expenditures of different extra budgetary funds due to the specific non-tax revenues, and that's quite obvious in a situation when, along with the creation of a new state fund, they introduce a new public payment that will become the main source of revenue for this extra budgetary fund. So here I'd like to stop the my report, and I thank you for paying attention to that. Thank you, Albert. Distinguished colleagues, now we have time for the reports of the board members. So you have 10 minutes to voice your reviews, or you can dwell upon the major remarks as you wish. And before I give the floor to our members of the board, I am to inform you that there are 3 external reviews submitted for the thesis. That's the report by Mr. Troshinsky, candidate of legal sciences from the Institute of Far East of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and also 2 reviews from our professors from the People's Republic of China. That's Professor Gandan of the Southwest University of Political Sciences from Chongqing, his PhD, and also Pan Sui-gan, also a PhD professor of the Shenyang Normal University from Shenyang, People's Republic of China. So, Albert, how do you define? Will you answer all the comments after all the speeches or after each? If there is such a chance, I would like to answer all the questions after they are voiced, if you do not mind, if there is such a chance. Okay. If the members of the board agree with it, we'll make it this way. So Albert will answer all the questions after the questions. So first I would like to give the floor to Oksana Nagina. Please, Oksana, you have the floor. 10 minutes, Oksana. Yes? Okay. Distinguished colleagues, getting acquainted with the thesis, I can make quite obvious conclusions that the topic is quite a novel one, that it is comparatively legal, the comparison of the budget systems of Russia and China. Certainly the topic is relevant in this case, and that is one of the first such studies, and I believe the author has certain problems to perform it because there are some specific sources for this study, and also the systems are different, considering the fact that the state structures are different. China is a unitary state, Russia is a federation. So, quite different states, yet the budget systems, both in Russia and in China, remains a budget system, and the formation of the public funds have certain general principles and structures. Therefore, it would be obviously interesting to detect certain regularities and peculiarities of the Chinese budget systems in order to see the processes that happen in the Russian Federation using this comparison basis of the two states that do not resemble each other so much. Therefore, that's about the relevance of the topic. As for the novelty, it stems from these basics of the studies of the comparison of two varied systems. Yet the author managed to identify certain provisions, to word these provisions, which was not quite easy, I believe, in order to find these provisions and that are brought for the defense. It is interesting to see the analysis of these extra budgetary funds of China, which are quite different from the Russian ones. That's an advantage of this thesis, in which the author dwells upon the differences and details. Here I'm referring to the extra budgetary funds and also to the institutions that exist in the budget system of China. We can see that in the thesis: extra budgetary social funds, extra budgetary investment funds, and so on and on. Author mentioned that as well. Therefore, novelty is quite clear. And as for the comments, that's quite a specific topic. It's hard to ask certain questions, but still it would be interesting to see Chinese experience in such experiments of the development of the regulatory framework in China. And the author mentioned that in China, adopting such a legal method as the method of legal experiment in budget legislation is something. It is something interesting. And the first question is: how can you, studying the budget system of the Russian Federation, how can you? What do you think? Is it possible in Russia to have such an experience of the legal experiment, regulatory experiment? If we talk about the regulation of the budget system development of Russia. And above all, it's interesting, and the author has this conclusion brought for the defense, the conclusion that regardless of the federal structure of the Russian Federation, our budget system has certain unitary trends. That's one of the provisions that the author wants to defend. And regardless of the fact, the budgetary system of China, and we're not talking about specific parts of Greater China. We're talking about the mainland China. And regardless of its certain unitary characteristics, it has a tend to decentralization, as far as I understand. That's on the local level. We're talking about some local authorities. And in this regard, it would be interesting to hear the reasons of such a decentralization states. Maybe it's there is a connection with the state structure, and to what extent this decentralization allows China as a state to successfully carry out its economic policy. Is it a benefit or rather not? And as for the Russian Federation, is it possible in the Russian Federation or not? Because many people are talking about the need to transfer more power to the subjects of the Russian Federation, because our system is quite centralized. Here I am talking about the budget system. And in Russia, I attended a conference, and there was a report dedicated to this decentralization of the budgetary system of Russia. So, to what extent will this option be efficient in Russia? So here are the questions, but overall I have a very positive impression on the work. That's quite a high-quality work, very logical one, and the conclusions are quite fascinating. Thank you. Thank you, Oksana. I give the floor to the next member of the board. That's Abdukhalil Davlatali. Please, you have the floor. Dear colleagues, hello once again. Hello, Mr. Trofimov. Really, as for the relevance, there is such a thing when a researcher analyzes two state systems and two regulation options of two different state structures. It demonstrates its relevance. I've already submitted my review, and as a question, I would like to give you a few words on my position. And there are certain points in the thesis that demonstrate that the topic is quite relevant. It is analyzed from different points of view, and when we mention legal regulation in the title of the work, and in the content we have the principles of the establishment of the systems in the states. This also adds up to the relevance of the study. And then the author dwelled upon the principles of the establishment of the systems in China and in Russia. And overall, I believe that the basic idea is that these relations are regulated, and the regulatory norms regulate these legal relations in the system and budget relations as well. And unfortunately, and the goals, we did not see these goals on the resolution of these problems. How? Because in 3 paragraphs you mentioned the notion of the system, principles, and the relations between China and Russia. Paragraph 3.2 mentions that the principles of the budget system are connected with national state structure. And next paragraph says that there are principles connected with the formation of these revenues. So how can we explain this structure? And there is a repetition of this idea in the next paragraph. And certainly it would be wonderful to have a more detailed description here. And as for the goals of the study, have nothing, no wording on the principles. I believe that you should bear that in mind. And as for the provisions brought for the defense, in Article 4, you answer that there is lack of legal description of the following principles in the Chinese law, that they are not enshrined in law. And that character of legal regulation allows us to define the system of these principles. So over here there's a very good idea about the principles of the execution of these legal relations. And as overall, these are the general notions. So I want to specify, did you make this conclusion maybe you formulated the provision on the study of these principles. And you mentioned that in your thesis in detail. And as for the comparative analysis of China and Russia, we had doctoral dissertations prepared on the topic, and certainly we consider the difference in codes, and within the framework of the CIS countries we have certain peculiarities. And now, as for China, I would like to ask you, maybe within the framework of the ASEAN or maybe some bilateral relations, may give us some regulatory acts that regulate these legal relations. For example, now there is a pandemic, and were there certain events or had anything happened within the framework of these international relations? Because we have this strategic partnership thing between the countries, and in the thesis you mentioned that historical legal connection of two countries it is believed that there is one policy and two states, or maybe it's vice versa. So that's what I wanted to ask. So what are the specific events that were performed between these two states in budget system? Because we know that quite recently, on behalf of the Russian Federation, there was this. There were certain developments. Therefore, it would be interesting for us if you would comment on that questions as well. And overall, the thesis meets the requirements of the order on the procedure of granting academic degrees, and we ask the members of the board to support the candidate for the degree, and we are eager to continue cooperation in this field. Thank you very much, Abdukhalil, and thank you very much for the interest. Thank you very much for this mentioning of further cooperation. That's very important for St. Petersburg State University as well. And now I give the floor to Madam Pavetkina, our old friend, and the old friend of our department, and our ally in working with the budget system of the Russian Federation. Thank you very much, Natalia. Distinguished colleagues, distinguished academic secretary, distinguished candidate for the degree. First of all, I would like to thank for the invitation to take part in this board session on the defense of this particular work, because I got acquainted with the author. I paid attention to his work before because I'm interested with the problems of budget law and budget legislation, and certainly the topic that was raised in his publications. This topic interested me as well, and I got acquainted with his works. And when I got this proposal, I was quite glad. My full review was published already. I provided it to the dissertation board, and certainly I fully support the colleagues who were giving the floor before me. As for the provisions that demonstrate the relevance, the scientific novelty, the practical importance of this work, the integrity and the fullness of the study, therefore, if you don't mind, I will just dwell upon certain not critical comments, but rather some comments for discussion and recommendations, because the topic is quite a complicated one, and we should mention the bravery of our author, because indeed that's such a scale of the study that was carried out, and I was quite surprised and pleasantly surprised when there was this technical description. There is this insignificant technical description, but there is a lot of analysis and a lot of explanation for the conclusion, so I was very fascinated to read the thesis. As for my remarks, I understand that certainly when you talk about large-scale work, it's hard to reflect all the details that sometimes may be of particular importance. And two examples for that. There are two basic comments that I had. First, regardless of the full agreement with the systematization and the description of similarities, I beg your pardon. Oh, no, it's okay. I thought that our foreign colleague had some technical failure. Okay. Regardless of the fact that... I missed the point. Regardless of certain similarities and differences that the author describes in the studying of principles of functioning of the budget systems of both countries, the author makes the conclusion and identifies the legal regime of the immunity of the budget as a principle. And in this regard, I cannot but ask a question to our candidate for the degree. What are the reasons that forced you to identify this legal regime as a principle, and why, regardless of the fact that the budget code of the Russian Federation enshrines an integral list of the principles of the budget system, you decided to expand this interpretation of our domestic principles? And second point, as far as I see it, I can presume that maybe that's just a certain creative development, but as it is given in the provisions brought for the defense, and it is described in the first lines of the thesis, and you are most interested to read this part. By the way, so I have this question: what do you imply by? So, what do you include in this legislation on budget systems? Because a more traditional use of terminology is just budget legislation that regulates certain provisions. Is it the same thing, or maybe you have certain differences here because there are certain norms and regulations that regulate the structure of the budget system? Maybe there are certain nuances here that were not fully described in the text. And certainly it's very interesting to read the provisions on the correlation of this definition of revenues and expenditures, and that's quite a pressing issue for the Russian system, because there are attempts to directly enshrine that in law, that there is a direct connection of revenues with expenditures, and it's not always possible sure enough. But anyway, for non-tax revenues today, there is such an exclusion that exists, such an exception that exists. And as for tax revenues, that's banned by the principle that you mentioned in your speech with combined coverage. And also you mentioned that that is quite widespread in the establishment of extra budgetary funds of the People's Republic of China, and therefore I would like to hear about the prospects of the introduction of this instrument and mechanism within the framework of our Russian Federation, because that is a relatively direct financing that is provided here, and as for this, the use of this principle in other budgets, that's not quite clear. And the finalizing recommendation or question is as follows. Today we see quite active reforms in our budget legislation, and previously we discussed that there is a new wording in the budget code. There are experts working on that, and budgetary system is defined differently. There are not just traditional budgets. They also decided to include the participants of the budget process. And indeed, as it is not an adjacent but rather a directly connected topic, I would like to listen to your position and on the expediency of this expanded interpretation of the budget by including this subject content. But these recommendations, they are just options for discussion, and my comments are explained by this creative approach of that the author has. And sure enough, the thesis by Trofimov, titled Legal Regulation of Budget Systems of Russia and China, meets the requirements of the order. As of September the 1st, 2016, and the candidate for the degree deserves the academic degree of the candidate of legal sciences in specialization 120004, financial law, tax law, budget law. Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. Indeed, the state of our budget system does not allow the researchers to relax. You've just described one thing and they offer yet another thing. Now I would like to give the floor to Roman Shipenko. Ivan, thank you very much for taking our invitation. That's an expert in Chinese law, and that's quite a rarity and quite a luck for us that you agreed to participate in the work of the board. Thank you very much once again. Thank you very much for the opportunity to deliver my review. Thank you very much for this positive assessment. I would like to agree with the words on the relevance of the topic. There's no doubt about that, and really addressing the Chinese legislation is easily explained because they managed to achieve quite impressive results in economy, and that's quite a well-known fact. They did not use such an instrument of privatization. No free sale happened there. And above all, they efficiently involved foreign investments, and they attracted them not by the expense of the workforce or the investments to the infrastructure. They also really provided the tax benefits for the appropriate period, the 90s. This tax rate was reduced up until 15 from 30%. And that worked in combination. That was not just tax part. And as a result, we can enter any shop, and across the world we can see this Chinese product. Certainly there are problems with quality sometimes, but the achievement is quite significant. And as for the School of Chinese Studies, addressing the Chinese law does not cause any surprise. That's the Soviet Chinese school. The Soviet School of Chinese Studies had always had some fundamental works and impressive biographies, and in this regard, it's really wonderful that the interest to Chinese law does not subside, and there are new attempts, and as far as I see it, there are quite bold attempts. And here I mean that the budget law has never been quite a simple topic to study, and the choice really deserves positive assessment for his courage, And I agree with the assessments of the research, and I wanted to mention some of the advantages that rich doctrine material that the author used, partially that was described in the reviews of Chinese experts that submitted their reports, and Professor Kazansky mentioned that the reference list is very important in the study because it connects the previous studies with the most state-of-the-art state of problem, and that is really what we see in the thesis and that we consider today, and sure enough that's an advantage. And when we study the law of another state, it's very important because understanding the state of legal regulation based just on regulatory issues, that's impossible. Therefore, addressing the opinions of foreign scientists allow us not just to understand the topic better, but also have a different view on the problem. It allows us to have a wider view, and we can also talk about the advantages of some general advantages that are not dealing directly with the topic of research, and special advantages. As for general advantages, I want to support the author in his critical remark regarding the existence of economic law. I don't support this growth to this cases of invention of new fields. As for special aspects, indeed here we should pay attention to the words of the author that the acts of the Communist Party can have the status of the sources of budget law, but we should specify that that is also true for the tax law as well, and maybe in other spheres. That's an interesting model. I did not track whether it is quite used today, but previously the regulatory acts were adopted quite frequently, and in conclusion they mentioned as experiment, and there's no such a permanent thing as a temporary thing, and these acts continued to act for a very lengthy period of time. That's an interesting tool for lawmakers as far as I see, considering certain provisions. And overall, there are a lot of advantages and achievements of this thesis, and they can be thoroughly analyzed and assessed, but taking into account my role as an opponent, I won't dwell into these advantages, and there's no such option considering the time limit. Therefore, I'll switch to the critical part. So I described everything in detail in my review that was submitted, and in this case I will read out just one of the aspects, one of the critical remarks. And that is also a question to our candidate for the degree. I asked to explain the reason why you decided to pursue this route. So initially, I'll read out the critical component and you will understand what I mean. The question was, why did you choose such a model? There is lawmaking process of writing a thesis is also creative work, and the choice of such an approach that is not quite clear and it requires some explanations. Based on the work, we see that the author used such an instrument as cliché of the Russian law. In due time, Professor Khudosnikov had a negative opinion of the use of such an instrument. He divided the Chinese studies into two groups, with the use of clichés and without it, and said particular elements of such clichés is something that we can see in the thesis. I can sort out two of them. First, the establishment of categorical kit. And the author says that based on the analysis of the Constitution and the law of the People's Republic of China on budget, we can define the budget system as, and then he gives the definition of the budget system. And getting acquainted with this definition, it becomes clear that that's nothing else as Article 6 of the Budget Code of the Russian Federation. The only difference is that you use the People's Republic of China instead of the Russian Federation here. And that is the same is true when we consider your words that in the Budget Code of the People's Republic of China there are no such other term. For example, you demonstrated that there is a drawback, that there is lack of the definition of budget relations, legal relations. And here I see the influence of Russian academic school. On the one hand, certainly, that's an advantage, that's our school. But on the other hand, maybe that's a disadvantage. A regulatory act is not a legal glossary that can cover all the categories at once. And it's naive to think that a lawmaker in each particular case introduces some new meaning to this regulatory norm, and he's always successful with that. There are examples of Article 12, in Article 12 of the Federal Law of 1998 on the protection of the economic interests of the Russian Federation when carrying out foreign trade. And in this article there was this definition of a specific subsidy as one of the bases to apply appropriate measures, and there were no other indications in the text, so there was a kind of exception. And studying the adoption of the law, we managed to understand what happened, how did it happen, therefore expecting to find certain true in this content of regulatory norm is incorrect. The most so it's incorrect to have all the definitions anytime. And you all know that after the adoption of a law on the basis of tax system, our scientists started to discuss and to propose definitions of taxes and tariffs and duties, and they started to criticize the lawmaker for not providing this definition. After that, the tax code was adopted, Part 1, and Chapter 8 has this final definition. What happens next? Once again, there is a lot of criticism. The legislation is still is still not ideal. So first of all, we ask them to introduce definitions, and after that we criticize them for this introduction. I believe it's not a correct approach here. The same is true, I believe, for the content of legal principles of another state provided by the author. In the work, there is a list of principles of the establishment of the budget system of China. Judging by the previous remark, it's easy to understand why do I criticize. I criticize because this content is a copy of Article 28 of the Budget Code of the Russian Federation once again. But maybe that is not the most important point. It's important that further on the author makes a conclusion, so he creates a list of principles, and after that he makes a conclusion that the list of principles resemble each other, they are the same. I believe that's an incorrect approach. But I should defend the author's position as well, because he was quite close to the point when he wouldn't use these cliches. He paid attention to this principle of legality, but he was influenced by other works. From time to time, he mentions this principle, yet he said that as it is not enshrined legally, that's not a principle. Well, simply saying, I believe that's an incorrect approach, because the principle in essence is not a regulatory point. If there is no direct indication in law on the principle, it does not mean that there's no principle. That's a simple example. The rule of law principle. It's not enshrined as a rule directly in law, but still it's a universally accepted principle. There's no doubt about that. And as for legality principle, we should mention that this principle is actively referred to by foreign scientists, and not only in the budget law, but also in the tax law as well, what we are used to call the principle of legal regulation of tax relations, or the principle of the establishment of taxes by laws, referring to 58th article of the Constitution. They are referring to the similar articles and called the principle of legality. Considering this principle, they pay attention to the fact that this principle is supported by the states, and in his constitutions they are defined. And that's just a substantiation of the fact that the regulatory act and the principle are different categories from the point of view that you should not always be guided by the aspects enshrined in law. So that is my main question. Why did he choose such an approach that, to my mind, led him to some ambiguities? And maybe that's well, that was the reason why. And do I think so? Because that's always private judgment, and sometimes these are just the ideas for general discussion. And overall, I believe that the work deserves quite a positive mark. I'm not sure about whether I should read my final opinion in the end. No, not yet, not yet. Okay. So I sum up, and thank you for attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Shipenko. We are all the servants of positivism, and it's really hard to go beyond its borders. Okay. As a member of the board, I also need to voice my position, and distinguished colleagues, considering the fact that that is a positive review that I submitted to the Secretary, and I would like to emphasize that the situation The current situation, the pandemic, has demonstrated the relevance of the topic, and it requires further elaboration because we see how the People's Republic of China managed to successfully cope with pandemic as well. And that is impossible to do without the modeling of all the without the mobilization of all the budget resources, because these are the budget resources that should mostly be used in such a case. Therefore, I'd like to emphasize the importance of the topic, and I'd like to dwell upon the fact that overall I have a very positive impression, but I would like to dwell upon the following facts as my remarks. First, Albert really asks very complicated very hard questions in his work. He provided his opinion on them, but sure enough, there are some unevenness, and there is this subjective view, there are these subjective views here as well. And as an expert working with budget law, I cannot but mention certain points. First of all, I believe that we should provide additional arguments to defend this idea that the budget code of the Russian Federation and the budget law of China are comparable, because you provide a comparison of these acts. So the question is on the validity of this approach. That's the first point. Second point is that my question is connected with the thing mentioned by Oksana already, that our Russian budget system tend to have some unitary characteristics, and Chinese system tend to some decentralization. To what extent is this important if we want to juxtapose the systems? And this difference between the systems, with this considering this stance, so how do you see it? Is it a potentially positive development of the regulation of the budget system in the future? And sure enough, the unity principle of the budget system is something that I could not ignore. I believe that's the key principle in our budget system. And to what extent is this principle of the unity of the budget system applicable to the assessment of the Chinese legal regulation, considering the fact that this principle itself is not enshrined in law, and this creates additional problems that were mentioned by Roman already. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. And we, as members of the board, had performed our duties, voiced our comments, and now I give the floor to our candidate for the degree. Albert, please, 20 minutes for your answer. Yes, first of all, I would like to thank the members of the board for such an in-depth study of my law, for attention to positive parts, for valuable comments that you've given, and I've just grouped the comments into kind of groups. So the first group on the characteristics of the budget system. The first question voiced was a question on the characteristics of unitariness in Russia and decentralization in China. The work was based on the works of our academic school, and initially this idea was fully described in the works of Natalia Shevelova, and we believe that regardless of the fact that there are over 10 years that passed, the Russian budget system, regardless of the multiple amendments introduced on an annual basis, the budget system still continues to retain these characteristics. And in order to support this idea, we can give the new arguments. And I would like to dwell upon one of them, the change of Constitution of the Russian Federation, Chapter 123, on the correction of the authorities of local authorities regarding the tax collections that led to an abolition at the federal level, and they still had these authorities on the introduction of taxes, and certainly this will be reflected on the ability to act independently. And maybe this will even strengthen this unitariness principle of the Russian system. And as for the budget system of China, its decentralization is demonstrated by the results of analysis of the volume of budget and tax authorities, of local authorities. They can define the basic elements here, and the question on the distribution of the tax and non-tax revenues to the benefit of local budgets. So we are talking about the fact that there are a lot of financial resources here from the point of view of distribution between the budgetary systems that are going to the local revenue budgets. And here we should mention the difference in the legal nature of the local budgets of the Russian Federation as financial basis of such a constitution value as local self-rule, and also the nature of local self-rule in China. And it's mentioned in the work that the budget system has 5 tiers. The first one is central, and other 4 are the levels of local budgets. And those local budgets are the budgets of the public authorities that are found in the entire system of the public administration. They are not divided into certain powers as in the Russian Federation. Here we talk about the provisions of the constitutional reform in Russia as well. As for the question by Professor Shevelova on the difference of budget systems of the 2 states, I would like to also mention that the tend to unitarism and decentralization in the 2 countries, it does not mean that there is this certainty here. Considering the reforms, they combine both legal norms aimed at strengthening of this unitariness and the norms that can demonstrate certain decentralization characteristics. And overall, answering this question, I would say that the specification of parameters of these characteristics with a change of budget regulation allows the lawmakers to find optimal approaches in order to resolve the state problems of the management of public finance. Next question on the principle of budget systems, and here I would like to dwell upon the comment regarding the question of Professor Gafarzada about the development of this system of principles and why is it connected with the Institute of the Budget System. Here I would like to say that the budget system is considered as a key institution of the budget law, and that's the budget law of Russia and China as well. And here we considered specific prerequisites for the opportunity to organize this legal comparison, because we when we read the budget code of the Russian Federation, we see this list of principles, and at the same time we have certain prerequisites in order to say that there is an Institute of Budget System in China, and maybe this budget system is based on certain principles. And accordingly, the studies here were aimed to formulate the principles of the development of the budget system. This methodological approach that was the basis of division and progress in Chapter 3 on defining different groups of principles. It is not aimed at the introduction of some new knowledge, but it methodologically allowed us to group the appropriate conclusions according to certain problems, how these principles answer the following questions. And the principles that we are called the principles of the budget system in our code, if we analyze them thoroughly, we see that there are principles regarding other institutions of Russian law as well. Therefore, in this regard, I would like to dwell upon this fact as well. And as for the unity principle of the budget system in the People's Republic of China, here I would like to mention that unlike the Russian legislation in Chinese budget code, we do not see the regulatory definition of certain norms, and maybe that can be a comment to the question of Roman Shepenko that we don't see normative or definition. Maybe it can be taken out of the analysis of the whole range of regulatory acts, and the majority of them are bylaws, in fact. And the conclusion on the existence of this principle is something that we can make based on the fact that the goals of the adoption of the law on budget was to standardize the budget scheme, and the formation of this budget system is to outline the stages of, and standards of publication of information and so on. And second, the analysis of this consolidated budget definition, when we have no legal definitions, it allows us to say that general budget of China includes central budget and all local budgets, and in other words, it is defined at the central level, and they approve the consolidated budget of the People's Republic of China, and this leads us to a unity in this system. And yet another argument is that the inclusion of extra budgetary funds means that these rules also cover each element of the budget system. And as for the question on the principles of immunity of the budget, that's Professor Pavetkina that dwelled upon this issue. Here I should recognize that indeed the legal regulation and the position of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation define the immunity of the budget as a certain legal regime. And at that point, and in the literature, we see that in the theory of the budget law, the immunity regime is not a mandatory characteristic of public authority, and it is rather a forced measure because it provides for an increased control of the legality of the collections for public resources. And at the same time, in theory, there is no specific general definition of legal immunity. Therefore, as for budget immunity, we need to say that that's a legal immunity. And the use of this immunity category as a principle, first of all, is connected with the importance of this principle for the entire budgetary system and its applicability in the execution of core decisions. If we talk about the budgets of any level of the budget system, here we can say that this principle covers the entire budget system, not just the federal and regional or local level. And at the same time, probably third is that it's not covered by Article 28, but rather in Article 139, because its legal message can be assessed as a principle. And if we talk about the principles of the budget system, that include the principles of different institutions of the budget law, therefore referring the principle of immunity of budgets here is not an inconsistent approach. Then on methodology, the comments, there were certain comments that were given in reviews, and I would like to cover them as well, even if they were not voiced. The description of methodology in the introduction had a principal provision that research is based on the budget legal regulation of the mainland China, and therefore every time when I mention China, I refer to mainland China, and the position that I voiced today here we should consider the People's Republic of China, its mainland part, because it allowed to simplify the text and and this approach, by the way, is frequently used in different Oriental study literature. And as for methodology comments, the issue on cliches of the Russian law. When I studied Chinese law, I would like to mention the following thing. The use of Russian legal categories is a basis for organizing comparative studies. And here I would like to repeat that the object of study was not just the study of the foreign law of China, but also Russian law as well. Therefore, we could not ignore the approaches that we have in final discussion of Russia So it was impossible here, considering the lack of development of the theory of budget law in China, and that's recognized by many scientists in China. On this stage of development of the Russian sinology, it's impossible to organize certain studies without primary development of the categorical kit and stating this knowledge that could be formulated when we started the regulatory text. And I believe that the choice of the researcher here should be done to the benefit of the approach that would allow to describe the essential problem. If the category was already developed when you check the specificity, after that this theory can be applied to considered situation. And above all, I believe it's not quite possible to agree with the point that the formation of the principles of other state in the dissertation is carried out via the Russian norms. The principles of the budget system are defined as theoretically substantiated, and secondly, as normatively defined requirements of the budget law. Therefore, the work was based mostly on the analysis of the regulatory of the normative regulation in China, but after that, there was also this theoretical substantiation for that. Therefore, the principles, as far as I understand, the principles of the establishment of the budget system of China can be described using comparative analysis of the laws of China. And here is an argument on the substantiation of the use of this methodology. I would like to refer to the fact that those approaches that are found in both budgets, they correspond with the approaches that the international community has, those developed principles of efficient budget management and the management of public resources. They are divided by the OECD as well. And in this regard, we really see the correlation in a number of parameters, because we see that national lawmakers try to support these international positions. Then, I would like to dwell upon the issues on the offers. As Madam Nagina mentioned, the issue of the use of experimental order and the opportunity to use this Chinese experimental method in Russia. I would like to note that this method deserves certain attention and it can be taken into account in the Russian practice, yet we should be quite careful about it, because on the one hand, Russian lawmakers are acquainted with these approaches in financial law, for example. There were certain experiment laws for when we talk about experimental self-employment taxes, and sometimes certainly it can't be applicable in Russia. It can't be applied in Russia. But if we talk about the applicability of the Chinese approach on connecting the incomes and expenditures in Russia, this connection of revenues and expenditures from non-tax sources, it is covered by the principle of the general coverage. And if we talk about the limitation of public financial resources and broad array of goals, the need to maintain this principle is not questioned. And if we study the reforms of the Russian budget law, we see that the formal requirements of this principle are overcome, as I've already mentioned. Yet, Russian lawmakers, as far as we see, support their commitment to the principles of the Russian budget system. And considering that, I believe that Chinese experience in this broad connection of expenditures with certain revenues cannot be taken into account in Russia in such a manner. The next block on separate norms and laws, the issue of similarity of laws. So I have this description of similarity of the Russian budget codes and of the Russian and Chinese budget codes. So there are certain regulatory acts that regulate the relations in the distribution of the GDP in order to define the status of relations, basis of enforcement measures, and so on and on. But overall, we cannot talk about the codification nature of the Chinese budget law for a number of reasons. But still, as China has this unique regulatory act regarding the law, maybe there should be a certain comparison here. Maybe that's not that was not a goal of the research, but anyway. As for the question on the use of this definition of the legislation in budget systems, Natalia paid attention to that. Here I would agree with the comment if the use of this term was considered as an offer to introduce certain new definition. Certainly it's not the case. And in this case, I just referred to the regulations, and I don't want to introduce certain mass of regulation. I just mentioned the need to define this part of budget legislation that has this legal regulation of the budget system. And in an external review that I got from Mr. Troshinsky, there was a question on the need to analyze the provisions of the new civil code of the People's Republic of China adopted this year that comes into force in 2021. Certainly I considered the new norms of the civil code and to the current civil code, but as for the object of this regulatory act, it does not cover the relations that are characterized in the budget law. Therefore, these norms were not applicable here. And as for the question on the introduction of a new legal definition on the budget system, the draft of the budget code of the Russian Federation. Here I should note that it seems to me that in the draft they don't include these. They include these participants of the budget process for no reason, and other definitions correspond with the definition of a system as a system of entwined elements. And here we should include not just the object of legal regulation, but also the subject of legal relations. And here we lose this definition of unity. And second, the introduction of these participants will lead to the introduction of a new legal definition that would replace the previous definitions of the budget system, and this will just complicate the regulatory tax and conditions when the new code is aimed at simplification. And I would like to comment on the question of Professor Gafarzadeh regarding the regulatory act in the international regulatory sphere. These two facts are connected. We did not have this goal, certainly, and due to the object that we've chosen, we did not cover the international agreements, and budget sphere in this regard is such a particular sector here that compared with other sectors of law, I believe it's not that prone to change. Though in Russian legal system, the international agreements are sources of budget law as well. Yet, in this case, I believe we should mention the agreements that were concluded by the Russian Federation within the framework of this union state, custom union, and so on. And certainly the provisions may have a possible impact on the budget regional legislation, but they are not covered by the object of study. Maybe that is why they were not reflected. These ideas were not voiced in my dissertation. And overall, I would like to once again thank the members of the board for attention to my work, and the proposals that were voiced certainly will be taken into account in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. That is it. Thank you very much, Albert. I believe you fully answered all the questions, but still, distinguished members of the board, we have an opportunity to ask some specifying questions, or maybe add some critical remarks if you wish, if there are such questions or remarks. Do we have any? No questions? Okay, now I give the floor to the scientific supervisor. Please, Margarita, a few words about our candidate for the degree. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Do you hear me well? Yes? So, certainly as a scientific supervisor, I'm a bit anxious today because we had this lengthy joint route, and starting from the very beginning of translations, of internships in the People's Republic of China, and this all finally led us to the elaboration of the concept of our research study, and this led us to the definition of those conclusions that have the scientific importance. And for me, that's of particular importance because this research work became a key professional development for Mr. Trofimov. The parameters of the thesis on the principles of the budget system, certainly they provide a reliable theoretical basis if we talk about further developments of certain institutions. And I can say that scientific supervision was quite comfortable and it was quite interesting. And it's important that during this period of time our department managed to acquire this fully developed expert with his specialization, and certainly I would be pleased to continue cooperation with Albert in this field. And my review is quite positive. That was submitted. I had quite a positive review submitted to the board, so I won't take more time for that. Thank you very much, Margarita. Distinguished members of the board, we had no questions submitted during the broadcast that could have joined online. Therefore, we can have two possible options. Either we announce a break and discuss our candidate for the degree and his defense in a closed manner, or we switch to open balloting. Is there a need to organize a closed discussion? Do we need to announce this closed discussion? There is an offer to continue in an open format. Yes, as far as I know. As far as I'm concerned. Yes, open discussion. Thank you. Okay, then I read out the formal text. So I raise a question on the award of the academic degree of the candidate of legal sciences to Albert Trofimov in specialization 120004, fiscal law, tax law, budget law, and we're going to have a voting procedure. And I would like to remind you that the decision of the we need 3 votes for that allow us to make a positive decision, but as we are to vote openly, I ask you to give your opinions. Please, Ghafarzada Abdul Khalil Davlatali, we support our candidate for the degree and we vote for the award of the academic degree. Natalia Pavetkina, please. Yes, I vote for as well. Thank you. Roman Shepenko, please. Yes, I vote for as well. And Oksana Nigina. Yes, I also support as well. I vote for the award of the academic degree. Okay, and my vote is the last one. I also vote for. Therefore, 5 votes for the award of the academic degree, and the decision is taken unanimously. And I announce the results of the vote. 5 people voted for, no one voted against, and no one abstained from the vote. So the decision on the award of the academic degree of the candidate of legal sciences to Albert Trofimov in specialization 120004, fiscal law, tax law, budget law is taken. And distinguished colleagues, distinguished members of the board, and distinguished guests, any comments or any questions on the procedure of our defense? None. Okay. If there are no such comments or questions, I would like to thank you very much for the trust, and I give the floor for finalizing remarks to our candidate of legal sciences. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the chairwoman of the board, all the members of the board, for the time and attention, for the studying of this work, for valuable ideas, because I believe it's of particular importance for a researcher to get professional feedback if we consider the prospects of further studies in further scientific work. Certainly, I would like to also thank St. Petersburg State University for the opportunity to organize the studies, for the opportunity to choose such new topics, and to be sure that you always have the support. And here I would like to thank our Administrative and Financial Law Department as well for providing us with the environment for the development of new ideas. And also I would like to thank my scientific supervisor, Margarita Kustova, who always supported me and was always ready to help with her consultations and give hints and give me the possible new development, new ideas, because initially the work on the topic was not quite obvious for me. And I would also like to thank my family for continuous support, because I managed to succeed thanks to them as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Albert, on behalf of all the members of the Dissertation Board, I would like to congratulate you on the award of the academic degree, and I congratulate us all, members of the board, with an interesting defense, successful defense. And I cannot but mention that Albert, indeed, is a PhD student that we are always pleased to work with. In due time, he got a grant of a young researcher, and this demonstrates that his participation in the scientific activity is not a matter of chance, that's a choice. And we hope that the young researcher will continue to work together with us to study the law of the budget law of both Russia and China. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for taking part in the discussion, and I hope that we'll see each other quite soon in online and in offline as well, when the conditions allow us to. Thank you very much, and we close the broadcasting. Yes, thank you very much for